If you're over 70 and the silence in your house doesn't frighten you anymore, you've won something. And most people never get there. There are 5 stages to that silence. I went through every one of them in order, and the 4th is the one nobody warns you about because it's the one where the silence starts talking back. My name is Walter. I'm 82 years old, and I've lived alone in this house in Maine since I lost my wife, Helen, 7 years ago. Maybe you're in a house right now that's quieter than it was. Maybe you've got the television on and you're not watching it, and you know exactly why it's on. There's no shame in that, and I did it for the better part of 2 years. So let me lay the 5 stages out, and you'll know which one you're in before I'm through with the second. Stay with me to the 4th. That's where it turns, and that's the one I most want you to know is coming. The first stage is the silence that's an alarm. This is the first weeks, maybe the first months. And the thing about it that nobody tells you is that it doesn't sound like quiet. It sounds like something being wrong. Because for 54 years, this house made a certain amount of noise. Not conversation, just the noise a shared life makes. Somebody in another room, a tap running, her voice saying something I wasn't listening to. And my ear had spent 54 years using that noise the way you use a pilot light. Not paying attention to it, just registering that it was lit. When it went out, every quiet moment was an announcement. And I'll tell you something I've never said out loud, and I'm saying it because I think a good many of you know exactly what I'm talking about and have been carrying it alone. For about the first month, I heard her. On the landing, mostly. That particular sound of somebody moving around upstairs, I'd be at this table, and I'd hear it plainly, and I'd stop. I'm not telling you the house is haunted. I don't believe that, and neither would Helen. What I believe is that 54 years builds a machine in your head that listens for one particular person, and when the person stops, the machine keeps running for a while. It stopped after a few weeks. I've since found out it's common. Marie, who's my friend Bob's widow, had the same thing and had never told a soul about it either. And I want to say to anybody who's had that, there's nothing wrong with you. It isn't a warning sign about your mind. It's a machine that ran for 54 years, taking a while to wind down. That's stage 1. And you can't do anything about it except let it pass, which it does. If you're walking this road alone, subscribe to this channel so you don't have to walk it alone. All right, second stage. The second stage is the silence you run from. And this is where most people get stuck, and a fair number of people stay stuck for the rest of their lives. Once the alarm stage passes, once you stop hearing them on the landing, once your ear finally accepts that the pilot light is out, what's left is just a very quiet house. And the very quiet house turns out to be worse. Because in the alarm stage, the silence was full of her. Terrible, but full. In the second stage, it's just empty, and empty is the one that gets in under your ribs. So you fill it. Everybody does. And it happens so naturally that you don't experience it as a decision at all. Mine was the television. Helen and I had one for decades, and we watched it the way people do. A few hours in the evening, something we both liked. After she died, I turned it on, and it more or less didn't go off again for 2 years. I counted once, sometime in that second year, sat down with a pencil because I'd started to suspect something. 11 hours. 11 hours a day that thing was on, and I could not have told you the name of a single program I'd watched that week. That's not watching television. That's a man running a machine to keep a room from being quiet. And I want to be careful here because I'm not going to sit and lecture anybody about their television. If it's getting you through, it's getting you through, and there are worse things. But I'd want you to know what it costs because I didn't know, and it took me a long time to work out. Noise doesn't only cover the silence, it covers everything else that's in the room with the silence. For 2 years, I did almost no thinking. That sounds strange to say. I had a great deal to think about. A 54-year marriage that had just ended. 2 grown children I'd been half absent for. A father who died in 1966 that I'd never properly reckoned with. And the small matter of what I was going to do with whatever years were left. None of it got thought about. because thinking requires quiet, and I had made sure there wasn't any 11 hours a day for 2 years. The grief didn't get processed. It got postponed. And postponed grief doesn't sit still and wait politely. It goes underground and comes up through the floor somewhere else. And you find yourself at 77 years old, furious about a thing that happened in 1985, and you have no idea why. The noise wasn't helping me, it was holding the whole business in place. And there's a second cost that I only worked out later, which is that noise is very good at making a day disappear. An evening with a machine running in it leaves nothing behind. Nothing happened in it. You can't remember it the next morning because there's nothing to remember. You weren't in it, you were sitting near it while something else made sound. I have 2 years of evenings like that, and I could not give you an account of a single one of them. 2 years, somewhere between 700 and 800 evenings, gone completely, out of a life that hasn't got a great many left in it. That's the part that bothers me most looking back. Not that they were sad evenings. Plenty of them weren't sad at all. I was numb rather than sad. That's what the noise was for. It's that they weren't anything. I paid 2 years of my remaining time for the service of not having to be present, and I got exactly what I paid for. Now, I'd say something to anybody who's in stage 2 right now, because I know what advice sounds like from a man who's out the other side, and I'd like to be careful with it. I'm not telling you to turn it off tonight. I didn't. Mine broke, or I'd likely have gone on for years. What I'd say instead is smaller. Notice what it's for. That's all. Just once, sit down and ask yourself honestly what that machine is doing in your evening, and whether you could name one thing you watched this week. Because once you've noticed, something starts. Not immediately, but a man who knows he's using a television as a wall is a different man from one who thinks he's watching television. And the first one eventually turns it off. The second one never does, because he doesn't know there's anything to turn off. That noticing is the whole of stage 2. You don't have to act on it yet. Before the next one, tell me in the comments which of these 5 stages you're in right now. Just the number. I'd like to see it, and I think a lot of people watching would find it useful to see they aren't the only one at that stage. And tell me what helps you on the hard nights, if you found something that does. I read every single one, and I answer as many as these old hands allow. And if this is helping you, that thumbs up tells YouTube to show it to somebody else sitting alone tonight. Third stage. The third stage is the silence you fight. This is the hardest one, and it's the shortest, and everything depends on getting through it. For me, it started because the television broke. I want to be honest about that. I didn't have a revelation. A machine failed. It went sometime in that second year, and I put off replacing it for a week or so, and in that week, something happened that I hadn't planned on. I found out what I'd been avoiding. Here's what the fight actually is, and I'll describe it as plainly as I can, because I think knowing what it feels like is most of what a person needs. You turn the noise off and sit down in a quiet room. And for about the first 20 minutes, it is genuinely bad. Not sad, bad. Everything you've been out running arrives at once, and it arrives with interest because it's been waiting 2 years and it has accumulated. Your mind, which has had a machine to lean on, suddenly has nothing to lean on. And it goes looking for something to occupy itself with, and what it finds is whatever you've been keeping the noise up to avoid. For me, that first week, it was the graduation. David graduated from the University in Orono in 1989, and I didn't go. I said it was the job, and there was a real job and a real deadline. What was also true, and what I didn't admit to anybody for 30 years, was that I was afraid of the emotion of the thing, of not knowing how to be proud in a room full of people, of being wooden in a moment that mattered. I sat in that chair in a quiet house at about 77 years of age and thought about a 22-year-old boy in a crowd looking for a face that wasn't there. And it was the worst hour I'd spent since the funeral. That's the fight. That's what's on the other side of the noise, and it's why people keep the noise on, and I understand it completely. But here's the thing I most want to say tonight, and it's the reason I put this stage in the middle. 20 minutes. That's about how long the bad part lasts. 20 minutes and then something settles. I don't fully understand the mechanism, and I'm not going to pretend to. What I can tell you is what happens. The mind, having gone looking for the worst thing and found it and looked at it for a while and not been destroyed by it, stops running. It stops hunting for an exit. It settles into the room. And once it settles, the silence changes character entirely. I sat in that quiet house for a week while I put off buying a television. And by about the fourth or fifth evening, the 20 minutes was still there, but I knew it was 20 minutes. That's the whole difference. When you know the bad part has a floor and you'll come out the other side of it, you can walk into it on purpose. I never bought the television. That's not a boast. I'd have bought one if it hadn't been for that particular week. But by the time I got round to considering it, I'd worked out what it had actually been doing, and I didn't want it back. And the graduation, I told David the truth about it eventually on his porch in Portland a couple of years later. He said, "Pop, I know. I figured that out a long time ago. 30 years I carried it, and 10 minutes cleared most of it. I would never have got to that conversation with the television on. That's the plain arithmetic of it. The noise was keeping me from the very thought that needed thinking, and the thought, once thought, led to a conversation that fixed something 30 years old. The 20 minutes is a toll. You pay it once an evening for a while, and then it gets smaller, and then one day you notice you didn't pay it at all. I want to give you the practical part of this stage, because it's the one where somebody could actually use some help, and I had none. The first thing is that you don't have to do it all at once. I did the whole week because a machine failed and I had no choice, and I wouldn't recommend it that way. 20 minutes is enough. Turn it off for 20 minutes after supper and sit down. That's the entire exercise. If it's bad at the end of the 20 minutes, you can turn it back on and you've lost nothing. The second thing is that you'll want something to do with your hands, and that's allowed. I've come to think it helps rather than cheats. A book counts. Tending a fire counts. A fire is one of the best things there is for this because it needs attention every few minutes and it makes a small amount of sound, and neither of those stops you thinking. What doesn't count is anything with a voice in it. That's the whole distinction as far as I can tell. A voice in the room takes the place your own thinking goes, and it doesn't matter whether it's a program or the news or somebody talking about a subject you find interesting. If there's a voice, you're not in the quiet. You're in company that can't hear you. And the third thing, which is the one I'd most want somebody to know, whatever comes up in the 20 minutes is what needed to come up. Mine was a graduation from 1989. I'd not have chosen it. If you'd asked me what I needed to work through in the second year after my wife died, I'd have said something about my wife. Instead, I got a boy in a crowd in Orono looking for a face, and that turned out to be the thing that was actually sitting on top of the pile. You don't get to pick. The quiet picks. And the thing it picks is generally the thing that's been getting in the way of everything else, which is exactly why the noise was on. And I'd add one thing for anybody who tries this and finds that what comes up is more than 20 minutes worth. Some of what's been waiting under the noise is too big to be handled by a man alone in a chair. I want to say that plainly. I got a graduation from 1989 and I could sit with it, and eventually I could have the conversation it pointed to, and that was the size of my particular problem. But if you turn the noise off and what arrives is bigger than that, if it doesn't settle after 20 minutes or 40 or a week of evenings, if it's the kind of thing that gets darker the longer you look at it, then that's not a job for a chair and a fire. That's a job for somebody trained, and there's no more shame in it than in calling a plumber, which I also did for 40 years before I learned to do it myself. I'm a carpenter from Maine. I'm not qualified to tell anybody how to handle the worst thing in their life. What I can tell you is what a wood stove and a quiet room did for a man whose problem was manageable. And I'd not want anyone taking that as a reason to sit alone with something that isn't. That's stage 3. It's the only stage that requires courage, and it's the shortest one. Weeks, in my case, not years. And on the other side of it is the part I didn't know existed. We're coming up on the 4th stage now, the one nobody warns you about. The fourth stage is the silence that talks back. And here's what I mean by that. Because it isn't mystical, and I'm not going soft in my old age. When you stop fighting the quiet, you find out it was never actually quiet. It was full the entire time. You just couldn't hear any of it, because you'd had a machine running over the top of it for 2 years. Here's what came back. This house makes a great deal of noise. I built it in 1971, and I know every sound in it. And in the years I had the television on, I had not heard one of them. The frame ticks when the temperature drops. A wooden house does that. It's the joints working. And on a January evening, when it's going from 20 above to 10 below, you can hear this whole building settle in a slow series of small reports. The third stair creaks. The east window rattles in a north wind and doesn't in a west one. And I know which way the weather's coming from by the sound it makes at 2 in the morning. The wind in those cedars. That's not one sound, that's a dozen. There's a July sound and there's a November sound, and they're not the same. And no one told me that in 82 years, I had to sit in a quiet room and work it out. The fire. A wood stove is company. It has opinions. It talks all evening. And underneath every bit of that, the thing I most needed and had been most thoroughly drowning out. My own thinking. That's the part that startled me. I had not heard myself think in 2 years, and I hadn't noticed I'd stopped. Because thinking, the real kind, not worrying, not going over things, actual thinking, where you start somewhere and arrive somewhere else, thinking needs room. It needs an evening with nothing in it. And I'd had 2 years of evenings with something in every one of them. Nearly everything I understand about my own life, I worked out in that chair after the television broke. Everything I've said on this channel, all of it came out of quiet hours between about 7 and 9 in the evening, in a room with a fire and no noise in it, in the years since I stopped being afraid of my own house. And then there's Helen. I want to say this carefully because I don't want it misunderstood. She turns up in the quiet, not as a presence in the room. I'm not making that claim and I never will. But in the silence with nothing else going on, she arrives in the ordinary way that a person you spent 54 years with arrives. A thing she said, the way she'd have laughed at something, an opinion of hers about a matter that came up today. In the noise years, I couldn't get to her. That's the thing I'd most want somebody to understand. I thought the noise was protecting me from missing her. What it was actually doing was keeping me from having her at all. The silence gave her back. Diminished, one-sided, in memory only. I know exactly what it is and isn't. But available. Every evening, if I want her. That's the trade nobody tells you about. You keep the noise on to avoid the pain of the absence. And the same noise blocks the only access you've got left to the person. You can't have one without the other. The quiet where she hurts is the quiet where she is. I'll take that. Every night. I chose it years ago, and I'd choose it again. And I'd tell anybody in stage 2 who's using the noise to avoid missing somebody. You're not avoiding it. You're only postponing it, and it's charging you interest. And in the meantime, you're locked out of the good half. Because there's a good half. That's the thing I didn't know for 2 years. Missing her is not only pain. There's an hour most evenings where she comes up in the quiet, something she'd have said about the weather, or a face she made in 1974 that I can still see perfectly. And it cost me something, and I would not give it up for anything on this earth. That hour was unavailable to me for 2 years. The machine was covering it along with everything else. I thought I was protecting myself, and what I was actually doing was locking the door on the only room she's still in. There's one more thing that came back in the quiet, and it's the one I'd have expected least, so I'll put it here. My own voice. I've mentioned in other talks that I speak out loud in an empty house, to Helen, and sometimes just to the room. That's a habit that started in this fourth stage, and it could not have started earlier. Because in the noise years, there was no room for it. You don't talk in a house with a television going. Nobody does. So for 2 years, I said almost nothing out loud, and I found out on a Thursday when my daughter called that I'd gone 4 days without speaking a single word, and my own voice startled me when I used it. That doesn't happen now. Now I say things, It's a hard frost. The bread's about done. That fellow on the radio doesn't know what he's talking about. Nobody hears it and it doesn't matter. And I defend that to anybody who thinks it sounds like a man losing his grip, because it's the opposite. A voice that goes unused for months becomes a stranger to its owner. Using it in a room with nobody in it, on purpose, is a man keeping hold of something. The quiet made room for it. That's the point. Silence isn't the absence of a voice. It's what lets you notice you've got one. Now, I want to be honest about the limits of this stage, because I've made it sound like a straight improvement, and it isn't quite. The quiet also lets in the things you'd rather it didn't. February evenings, when the light's been bad for 6 weeks and the wind's coming from the north, and nothing in particular has gone wrong. The quiet in this house on an evening like that can be a good deal to be in. There are still nights I don't get through it well. 3 in the morning mostly, which is a different animal from the evening in which I've talked about elsewhere. The fourth stage doesn't mean the quiet has become gentle. It means you've stopped needing to escape it, which is not the same thing. What I'd say is that the bad quiet passes and the noise never did. That's the honest comparison. An evening in the quiet that goes badly is over by morning, and it produced something. I generally understand something better afterward, even if it cost me an evening. An evening under the machine cost me the evening and produced nothing, and the thing it was covering was still there in the morning waiting. So it isn't peace, exactly. Not always. It's more that the quiet has become a place where things happen rather than a place where nothing does, and some of what happens is hard, and I'll take the whole arrangement over the alternative. That's the fourth stage. The silence stops being an absence and turns into a room with things in it. And once that's happened, you're most of the way home. The fifth stage is the silence you'd miss. This is where I live now, and it took about 4 years to get here, and I did not believe it was possible. Here's how I found out I'd arrived. There was a weekend about 3 years ago when the house was full. David and his wife and both their children, and Susan came up from Boston as well. 5 people plus me in this house for 3 days. First time since Helen died. It was one of the best weekends of the last decade. I want to say that clearly. I loved every hour of it. My grandson helped me in the shop. There were 6 people at that kitchen table, and it hadn't held 6 people in a long time. And they left on the Sunday afternoon, 2 cars down the driveway, and I stood on the step and waved, and I came back in and shut the door. And the house went quiet, and I felt relieved. I stood in that hall and I did not know what to do with myself, because for 2 years I would have given anything on this earth for that house not to be quiet. And here I was glad of it, and my daughter's car was still in earshot. I sat down in that chair and worked through it for the better part of an hour. And here's where I came out, and it's the 5th stage. The quiet is mine now. It isn't a hole where somebody used to be. It's a room I live in and work in and think in, and I have furnished it over 7 years, and I get things there that I get nowhere else. Loving that weekend and being glad when the house went quiet are not in conflict. That's what I hadn't understood. It only felt like a betrayal because I was still measuring the silence against the noise Helen made, and by that measure, any silence at all is a loss. I don't measure it that way anymore. That's the whole of the 5th stage, right there. And I'd say to anybody who has that moment and feels badly about it, because you will, and I did, standing in that hall listening to my daughter's car go down the road, there's nothing wrong with you, and it isn't a betrayal of anybody. Being glad the house is quiet again does not mean you wanted them to go. It means you've got somewhere of your own to go back to, and you are looking forward to it. The way a man looks forward to his own chair after a good long day out. Helen would have understood that better than I did, incidentally. She was the more sociable of the 2 of us by a good distance. She organized every bit of our life that involved other people. And she'd sit at that kitchen table for half an hour every morning by herself with a cup of coffee, and I used to think she was just slow starting. She wasn't. She was in her own room. She'd had one the whole time, and I never once asked her about it in 54 years. I've got one now. Took me 7 years and the failure of a television to find the door. She'd have been pleased about it, and she'd have said something short and slightly amused, and I'd have pretended not to know what she meant. The silence is not the absence of her. It's a thing in its own right that I built, that has my chair in it, and my fire and my thinking, and some evenings her. And there's a practical consequence of the fifth stage that I want to name, because it changed how I am with people, and I think it's the best thing that came out of any of this. When you can't stand the quiet, other people become noise. That's the ugly truth of it, and I'll own having done it. In stage 2, my son's Sunday call was not primarily a conversation with my son. It was 2 hours of the house not being silent. I looked forward to it all week, and what I was looking forward to was partly the relief. And he could feel that, I'm sure of it. There's a weight a call has when the person on the other end needs it to be happening, and David was carrying that weight every Sunday for 2 years and never once mentioned it. Now, I don't need the call. That's a strange sentence to say about your own son, so let me finish it. I don't need it to fill anything. The house was fine before it rang, and it'll be fine after, which means the 2 hours are just my son and me talking with nothing underneath it. Those calls got better, measurably. He talks about his work now and his daughter and whatever's on his mind rather than checking on his father. And part of the reason is that he's no longer being used as a wall. That's the thing about winning the silence that I'd never have guessed. It doesn't make you need people less in any way that matters. It makes you better company because you're not conscripting them. That's what the title means. If the silence at home doesn't scare you anymore, you've won. And what you've won is a room, a large one, that's yours, that you'll be in for most of your remaining hours, and that most people never manage to move into. Now, the honest part, and then I'll let you go. There's a silence I've been describing, and there's another kind, and they can look identical from the outside, and I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't separate them. Everything I've said tonight is about the silence inside a life that has people in it. Because here's what my week actually contains. My son calls every Sunday. My daughter calls every Thursday. There's a letter going back and forth with my granddaughter. Elaine from down the road comes for coffee most weeks and has a key to this house. Marie and I have lunch once a month. Saturday mornings I'm at the diner in town among people who know my name. The quiet I sit in on a Tuesday evening is quiet with all of that around it. Take those away and the same chair, the same fire, the same silence is a different thing entirely. That's not peace. That's a man alone in a room with nobody coming, and I've known men in that condition, and one of them was a friend of mine named Frank, who died at 76 with nobody close enough to have noticed how it went. Frank was not afraid of the silence either. Frank had won it by the test in my title, and Frank was in serious trouble. So the test isn't good enough on its own, and I'll give you the better one. Can you sit in the quiet and also pick up the phone? That's it. If the silence has become somewhere you can be, that's a genuine achievement, and I'm glad of it. But if it's become somewhere you hide, if you've made your peace with the quiet by quietly making your peace with nobody coming, then you haven't won anything. You've traded a loud problem for a silent one, and the silent one is harder to spot and considerably more dangerous. I've been on both sides of that line. In the second year, I told myself I was learning to be alone. I was not. I was going under quietly and calling it acceptance. The difference, as far as I can tell, is the phone. A man who's at peace in the quiet picks up the phone on a Sunday and is glad it rang. A man who's hiding in the quiet lets it go and has a reason, and the reason is always perfectly good. And I'd give you a second test as well, because the phone one is easy to fool yourself on. Have you initiated anything in the last month? Not answered, started. Called somebody who wasn't calling you? Asked somebody over? Said yes to a thing you'd have preferred to decline? Because that's where the hiding shows up, and it shows up there long before it shows up anywhere else. A man who's gone under will still answer the phone politely. He'll be pleasant. He'll say he's fine and mean it. What he won't do is pick the phone up first, and nobody notices that, including him, because not doing a thing leaves no evidence anywhere. I went about 18 months without initiating a single thing, answered everything, initiated nothing, and would have told you I had a perfectly good social life. So both tests. Can you sit in the quiet? And did you start something this month? If it's yes to both, then what you've got is peace. And it's rare and you should be glad of it, and I'd be pleased for you. If it's yes to the first and no to the second, then the quiet has become somewhere you're hiding, and you've probably known that for a while without putting it into words. And the fix isn't complicated. Pick up the phone. Today, ideally, one call to one person that they weren't expecting. So, both. That's the whole prescription. Win the silence and answer the phone. And I'll say the last thing, which is the part I find hardest to believe about my own life. I'd choose this. Not over having Helen back. I'd trade every hour of it for that. And anybody who says different about their own is not telling you the truth. But of the lives actually available to me at 82, with her gone and nothing to be done about it, I'd choose this one. A quiet house at the end of a long driveway. A fire in the evening. A chair I've been sitting in for 30 years. A shop 30 steps out the back with a drawer waiting to be fitted in the morning. 2 children who call, and a silence that used to be the worst thing in my life and is now the best room in it. That took 7 years, and I fought the wrong things for 2 of them. But it's where I ended up. If you're at stage 1 or 2 tonight, sitting in a house with a machine running so the quiet can't get at you, you'll get here. It doesn't come by waiting, and it doesn't come from anybody telling you to be positive about it. It comes 20 minutes at a time on the far side of the part that hurts. So that's the 5. The silence that's an alarm, the silence you run from, the silence you fight, which is 20 minutes long and is the whole of the work. The silence that talks back, and the silence you'd miss if somebody took it. Tell me which one you're in. I genuinely like to know, and so would a lot of people reading down that comment section tonight. Now, if what stayed with you was the last bit, the difference between being alone and being isolated, and how badly those two get run together, I made another talk about exactly that. About the 5 people I speak to every single week, and why it's 5 and not 15, and the 5 completely different jobs they do that I never knew somebody was doing until she was gone. That's the companion to this one, honestly. This talk is about the room. That one's about making sure it isn't the only thing you've got. It's right there on the screen. Go on over whenever you're ready. The fire's still going here and the kettle's still warm. I'll see you there.